I'm very, very pleased to have Kimberly Hamlin join us tonight. She's an associate professor of history and global intercultural studies at Miami University of Ohio, just outside of Cincinnati. Kimberly will be talking tonight. Again, the session is titled The 19th Amendment at 100 Years, a Centennial Reassessment Focusing on Sex, Race, and Memory. As I mentioned, Jen Jolly will be joining us at the TA. She'll be in the chat box sharing her thoughts and resources as a teacher. She's at Palm Bay Magnet High School in Melbourne, Florida. So, hey, Kimberly, nice to see you. Are you with us tonight?
Hey, Andy, it's great to be here.
You are. Thank you so much for joining. I really do appreciate you taking time from your own very busy and COVID-impacted world as an educator, as a parent, as a scholar. And we're really anxious to get into this topic and have you share with us your thoughts on the 19th Amendment. But before we do, I'd like to actually start with a personal question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And it taps a little bit into our opening chat prompt that we had, as you saw when we started the webcast. I'm just curious, where were you Friday night when you heard about Ruth Bader Ginsburg? What were your thoughts initially when you got the news?
Oh my gosh, I was home here in Cincinnati with my family, and my phone started blowing up with texts from my friends saying, "Oh no, have you seen the news?" So that was how I heard, and we sort of started mourning together, my husband and I and my friends via text, and I taught first thing Monday morning, well, sort of first thing, 10 a.m., and I'm teaching a new class this semester called Me Too, A Cultural History. And I have really the best bunch of students. They're so engaged and so passionate. So we started our class with a moment of silence for RBG. We watched some speeches, and then we shared our thoughts and reflections and ideas about, what's next.
What is next?
Well, we talked about things honor her legacy. We talked about things going on campus. Because of the nature of the class, there's a lot of campus activists in there, and I'm also the faculty advisor for a group called the F Word, which stands for Feminists Working on Radical Democracy. And by chance, the chairperson of the F Word was sitting in our class that day, so she sort of shared some things they're up to, and I let the students take it from there.
It must be pretty rewarding, though, to have your scholarship and your passion and what you study as an academic be so relevant and applicable to the world we're living in. And I don't mean to connect that to, the tragedy of RBG's death as much as, this is your moment. I mean, you've got an insight that we all need.
It has been very rewarding in the past few years since, I started kind of doing more public-facing scholarship, like writing op-eds for the Washington Post and other magazine essays. I have really learned so much, and I feel like it's really enhanced my scholarship. And it feels very, rewarding, fulfilling, inspiring to have my research so in conversation with current events and to be able to provide so much historical context. So just to give one quick example, the first time that I hit send, I had for many years thought, I want to write an op-ed about this, or I know something about that. But the first time I was propelled to action was in 2017 when Roy Moore was running for Senate, and allegations came forth that he had, raped or assaulted or hit on teenage girls at the mall. And people were talking about grown men with young girls. And so I thought, I know about that. I write about the age of consent. So that was my first op-ed, was the history of the age of consent campaign and how that kind of frames or might frame how we understand Roy Moore.
And that's why the humanities are not a luxury, right? That's why the work that you do and all humanists do is make sense of this world. And we appreciate you being here to help us make sense of this topic.
It's my honor and my pleasure. I'm really delighted, and I'm so inspired by everything you do and inspired by all the speakers and the webinars and the classes. And I'm just such a fan of everything you do at the National Humanities Center. So I want to thank you and Libby and Jennifer for hosting tonight.
Thanks. So I've given you the PowerPoint. Please advance it at your own pace. And again, as the moderator, I'll bring questions to you on occasion. And I do encourage the audience to drop those questions in the Q&A box on the lower left-hand part of your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andy. Okay, so as Andy mentioned, I'm sort of an evangelical for women's history, if you will. That's because I believe so strongly that the stories we tell about our past shape what we think is possible in the present and in the future. So for me, as a person who believes strongly in women's equality, I believe that means we have to also look to the past and reshape the stories that we tell about our past and center the experiences and contributions of women. So I'm very excited to be delighted to be talking with you tonight about the 19th Amendment at 100, focusing on the themes of sex, race, and historical memory. Much of the new scholarship and also much of the public programming here, I'm thinking, for example, of the wonderful National Portrait Gallery's exhibition, Votes for Women, in the New York Times' extensive suffrage centennial coverage. Much of the suffrage centennial exhibits and publications have been disrupting what historian Lisa Tetrault calls the myth of Seneca Falls. So I'm sure I don't need to tell you, as a large majority of history teachers, what the myth of Seneca Falls is. But for those who might not be as familiar, the myth of Seneca Falls is essentially the story that we tell that women's fight for the vote began in upstate New York in 1848 and ended in August 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified, and that the white women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and later Alice Paul represent this movement. As we now know, this myth is sort of true, but also sort of not true. For one thing, as Tetrault has established, Stanton and Anthony created this myth very consciously in the 1880s, and they did this to secure their leadership and status in the movement over their rivals, Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell. The myth of Seneca Falls also obscures the movement's origins and abolition and the vital contributions of women of color. So it's very exciting for me, and I'm sure for you, to see so many great new books, so many great new essays coming out this year that are really centering the experiences and contributions of women of color. And these are just two new books that I'm really excited about. Martha Jones' Vanguard, which came out just several days ago, and Kathleen Cahill's Recasting the Vote, which focuses not just on African American women, but also Chinese American women, Latina women, and Native American women. So it's very exciting.
Sorry to interrupt, Kimberly, but I should note Martha S. Jones, past fellow at the National Humanities Center.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
These are just two of the new books that I'm very excited about, and we can talk more about them later. I can make other recommendations, but it's really thrilling to see the myth of Seneca Falls being disrupted, being nuanced, and seeing so many new faces and names come to the fore. I think this is really important as well because of the way that suffrage and suffragists are typically depicted in textbooks. I think it's so important that students see women activist Americans who look like them, right? And this is a picture here, which I think serves as a stand-in for the way that suffrage is often depicted in textbooks, that it's super boring, that it's old, cranky white ladies in uncomfortable dresses, circulating boring petitions, right? So to the extent to which suffrage is included in textbooks at all, it's a sidebar, maybe with a couple names, but it's not presented as the vital, 3 generations long civil rights struggle that it was, populated and motivated by a diverse array of bold and brave and genius women. So I'm very excited that this scholarship is highlighting these stories. But I'm also a little bit concerned about the extent to which all this new research will actually be incorporated into our textbooks and into our state standards. Because I think it's important to remember that suffrage is just one aspect of women's history. And as a recent study by the National Women's History Museum, this is from 2017, this comprehensive study they conducted of state standards and civics and high school and history textbooks reveals that really our state standards and our history textbooks are so out of line with current scholarship and still, even today, present women's contributions to American life as sidebars to the quote unquote real history of wars and presidents. And the pictures here show that These are pictures of the women most commonly included in state standards, and you'll see they're predominantly white. There's just a handful of women, and for example, no states require students to learn the names or contributions of any Asian American women. So the Suffrage Centennial, the story of suffrage, is this one very emblematic example of how we might think in new ways about women's contributions to American life, how we might reframe our textbooks and our stories and our narratives to center the contributions and experiences of women. So tonight, that is what we're going to do. We're going to focus on how we might reframe and retell some of these 19th Amendment stories. And we're going to do so by focusing on three themes. One, sex. Andy says it's okay if we talk about sex here at the National Humanities Center, so that is going to be our first topic. Particularly, we're going to look at how the sexual double standard motivated thousands of women to demand the vote. Our second theme tonight is race, and more to the point, how racism shaped the trajectory of the 19th Amendment. And finally, a sub-theme of our entire discussion is historical memory, how our collective amnesia regarding women's contributions to American history hinders, in my humble opinion, women's equality today. And we're going to explore these three themes by using the example of Helen Hamilton Gardner, the free-thinking suffragist whose biography I just published in March of this year. I like to say that Helen Hamilton Gardner, or HHG as I call her, is the most interesting and important suffragist that no one has ever heard of. And I hope that after we learn about her tonight, we might say and ask ourselves things like, I can't believe I've never heard of Helen Hamilton Gardner. Who else have we never heard of? So who was HHG? HHG was the fallen woman, meaning that she had sex before marriage and everyone found out about it, who changed her name, reinvented herself, and became one of the best-known speakers and writers in the 19th century. In the early 1900s, as we'll see, she reinvented once more, married a Civil War hero, moved to Washington, D.C., and became the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington. The National American Woman Suffrage Association called her their diplomatic corps, and they credited her with getting the 19th Amendment through Congress. Her colleagues Carrie Chapman Catt and Maud Wood Park, with whom she worked on the Nassau Congressional Committee, claimed that Gardner was the most potent factor in congressional passage. We're going to learn more about that tonight. I first met HHG when I was working on my dissertation at the University of Texas at Austin. And my dissertation, which became my first book, explored how 19th century women used science for feminist purposes and to advocate for equality. So HHG was one of the women I studied because, as you can see here, she donated her brain to science to prove the intellectual equality of women. She even got her best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to agree to donate her brain, but Stanton's children refused to fulfill this bequest, and they started a lifelong rivalry with heathen Helen, as they called her, over whether or not Stanton's brain could go to the Burt Wilder Brain Collection at Cornell, which is where HHG sent her brain. She spared no expense to make sure that her brain would be studied, as indeed it was. Following the release of the study, the New York Times reported, "Woman's brain not inferior to men's." So that's how I first encountered HHG, and that's what made me want to learn more. But what I never could have anticipated at the time was that donating her brain to science was in fact the least interesting thing about her. I knew that I was going to write her biography when I came across this coded letter in the Adelaide Johnson collection at the Library of Congress. As you can see here, this letter is addressed to Little Phil, so no real names are used, and it's signed by Little One. But I recognized that handwriting in the top left, and as you can see, the underlined part says, "Best destroy this letter." Ooh, I thought, that's catnip for historians, right? What is in this juicy coded letter? And as soon as I recognized the handwriting in the Little One, I knew it was from HHG because she was just 5 feet tall and 100 pounds. In this letter to her best friend, Little Phil, who I later found out is Mary Phillips of New York City, she describes the double life she lived for 25 years with a man named Charles Smart, whom she told everyone was her husband, except for that he totally was not her husband. On his deathbed, she found a letter in his pocket from his wife and 2 daughters, who he had visited and kept up with the entire time that they were together. He also left everything, of course, to his wife, which created huge public problems, probate issues for Gardner when her lover died in 1901. So this is when I knew I was going to tell her story, because she lays out so clearly what inspired her feminist activism. And what inspired her feminist activism was the affair she had with Smart. So that will be the sex part of our story tonight. But first, let me tell you how she met him. HHG was born Alice Chenoweth, that's her on the left, as a young child. She was born Alice Chenoweth in 1853 in Winchester, Virginia, the youngest of 7 children born to the Reverend Alfred Griffith Chenoweth and his wife, Catherine. The Reverend Chenoweth was a circuit-riding Methodist preacher who traveled throughout the state of Virginia for his career. He also had inherited his family's slaves and the slaves of his wife's family, and this troubled him. He couldn't reconcile his Christian beliefs with the fact that he held other human beings in bondage. So when young Alice Chenoweth was just 1 in 1854, her father moved everyone to Washington, D.C., where he could emancipate the people he held in bondage. And then a year later, he moved the family to Greencastle, Indiana, in the hopes of avoiding the coming sectional conflict. Of course, this was not to be. The Reverend Chenoweth gets conscripted into service by none other than President Abraham Lincoln, who asks him to be a Union scout, because who could know the backwoods and valleys of Virginia better than a former circuit-riding minister? Alice Chenoweth's 3 older brothers also sign up for the Union. All 4 Chenoweth men either die in the war or receive life-altering, life-threatening diseases and injuries that shorten their lives drastically. So this is the example that Gardner, then known as Alice Chenoweth, grows up with, that what you do is you sacrifice everything for your beliefs. Of course, it was very unusual for slave-owning patriarchs of Virginia to emancipate their slaves and fight for the Union, but that's what her family did. Her family also lost everything as a result of the Civil War. So this too greatly impacts young Alice Chenoweth's life. The options that she saw at the time were marry young and begin having children, which is what her 2 sisters had done, but she also watches her sisters and her sisters-in-law bury their babies and then also die in childbirth. So she decides that is not the path for her. At the age of 19, she moves to Cincinnati and goes to Cincinnati Normal School, which was the teacher training school, known as the best teacher training school west of the Alleghenies. As you can see, she's also very beautiful, and she's a wonder in the classroom. So by the age of 22, she is the youngest school principal in the entire state of Ohio. She's living by then in Sandusky in northern Ohio, and she's the principal of the teacher training school there. Soon, her skill in the classroom, her good looks, and her personal charms bring her to the attention of Charles Smart, who at the time was the commissioner of schools for the entire state of Ohio. So his job is to travel around the state, making sure that students are performing well and that schools are up to snuff. But her neighbors in Sandusky begin whispering, "Why is Commissioner Smart constantly in our town? Sandusky is not the capital of Ohio. It didn't have the biggest or best school system. Why is this guy constantly in our town?" They want to know. And now here, Alice Chenoweth has the misfortune of boarding in this house here. These are the current residents, Sharon and Ezell Smith, who very kindly let me in to poke around. But this, at the time, in the 1870s, when young Alice Chenoweth is boarding there, is the Widow Melville's boarding house. So young Alice Chenoweth has the misfortune to board there along with the brother and sister-in-law of the guy who publishes the daily paper. So Alice Chenoweth's comings and goings are fast-tracked to the editor of the Sandusky Daily Register, who soon publishes, of course, that Commissioner Smart is coming to town, not to visit the schools, not to check in with the school boards, but instead to visit the young school teacher. The Sandusky Daily Register further reports that Commissioner Smart often shows up on Friday nights and leaves on Monday mornings when there's no schools in session. Furthermore, Commissioner Smart is a married man and father of 2. By the summer of 1876, this is a huge scandal across the entire state. Young Alice Chenoweth is forced to resign her hard-won job, which was also basically the only job that a middle-class white woman could get and support herself with in the 1870s. Papers around the state covered the scandal. Alice was run out of town, and by October, some of the papers even print her name, as you can see in this highlighted image from the Jackson Standard. Now, I want to just emphasize here that for most women in the 1870s, this would be the end of your life, right? Young Alice Chenoweth, she's just 23 now, has lost her job, she's lost her reputation, she doesn't have a family to fall back on, and everyone in Ohio knows that she's no longer a virgin, that she's a fallen woman. This is the stuff of most 19th century fiction, right? The sad, lonely demise of the fallen woman. Gardner knows this. She's grown up hearing it in revivals. She's read the novels. She's seen the newspaper headlines. She knows how this is supposed to play out for her. But something inside her, maybe it's her family's iconoclasm, maybe it's her already percolating free thinker tendencies, but something inside her says, no, I'm not going to take this. I'm going to instead pause, reflect, and reinvent. So for the next 8 years, young Alice Chenoweth reads and reads and reads, writes and writes and writes, and the questions she's pondering have to do with ideas about men and women, and in particular, the sexual double standard. She wants to know, for example, why was she run out of town? Why was she forced to resign her job when Commissioner Smart, as you already know, right, carries on just fine? He's not divorced, he's not shamed, he continues on in his career. She wants to know, she later writes, why is virginity considered a young woman's most valuable asset when no one would dare to suggest that virginity was the most valuable asset of a man? As she reads and reflects, she comes to understand, at least in her opinion, that the Bible is the root cause of the sexual double standard and of women's second-class status more broadly. So she begins writing down her ideas, and by 1883, she's moved to New York City, and she's changed her name to Helen Hamilton Gardner. Now, in the age before the internet and the age before Google, you could do this, right? You could simply pick up, move to a new city, change your name without the fear that anyone would ever connect you to the fallen woman known as Alice Chenoweth of Ohio. And this is precisely what HHG does. So she emerges on the public stage in January of 1884 as a free thought speaker named Helen Hamilton Gardner. She succeeds in convincing Robert Ingersoll, who you may know as the great agnostic, the most popular speaker on the 19th century lecture circuit. She convinces Ingersoll to be her mentor. This is the first example of Gardner's telltale charms, her beautiful letter writing. This is a skill we'll see again and again that she employs throughout her life. So she writes Ingersoll a letter out of the blue. She shares her thoughts about the Bible with him, and he says, oh, you must read these in public. So Ingersoll travels to New York City that cold night in January 1884 to introduce this new speaker that no one's ever heard of, who's never published anything, who's never spoken before. He introduces her, which guarantees her crowds and press coverage that no first-time speaker, especially not a woman that no one's ever heard of, could expect. So from there, she's off and running. She embarks on a highly publicized national lecture tour where she boldly states her ideas that the Bible is the root cause of women's oppression. She does this years and years before Matilda Jocelyn Gage's more well-known book, Woman, Church, and State, and she does this many more years in advance of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Woman's Bible, which isn't published to 1895. The next year, Gardner publishes her free thought lectures as a book called Men, Women, and Gods, which was widely reviewed and went into at least 13 editions. And this, too, secures Gardner's status in the free thought movement. Gardner said that she entered the movement as a voice for women because she knew many women thought the things that she did, had the same questions that she did, but were too afraid to say them out loud. And Gardner said she wanted to make it so that other women were not afraid to speak. From the free thought lecture circuit, she begins branching out into other reform publications, eventually into fiction, and to writing and thinking about other causes such as divorce reform, such as women's rights more broadly. By 1893, she's one of the best known women in America and one of the most highly sought after speakers. At the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, Gardner delivered more speeches than any other American woman. The New York Sun reported that next to Susan B. Anthony, Helen Hamilton Gardner created the profoundest sensation. They also reported, and other women reformers recalled, that so many people went to the rooms where Gardner was speaking, the police had to be stationed outside the doors, and that people began trying to bribe the police just to get inside. So that's how popular, that's how interested people were in hearing what HHG had to say by 1893. By 1893, Gardner also settles in on what to her is her signature issue, and that becomes raising the age of sexual consent for girls. Why does she pick this issue? Well, to her, it symbolizes all of the problems that the sexual double standard causes, kind of wrapped up into one. So it may or may not surprise you to learn that in 1890, the age at which a girl was considered legally capable of consenting to sex was 12 or younger in 38 states. In Delaware, it was 7. So Gardner, who herself is a fallen woman, but no one knows it, is drawn to this cause, right? She thinks this is wrong. This is an abomination. She wants to be the one to say the things that other women are too afraid to say. So she begins writing novels that are designed to draw public empathy, sympathy for the fallen woman, to flip the script on how these stories are told. These novels are called Is This Your Son, My Lord, from 1890, and Pray You, Sir, Whose Daughter, from 1892. Because of these novels, reviewers and other reformers begin to call her the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen women, because she's using fiction to draw an apathetic public to action to raise the age of sexual consent for girls. In 1895, she moves to Boston to edit a reform publication called The Arena. And she turns The Arena magazine into basically a single issue publication for the year of 1895 with the goal of raising the age of sexual consent for girls in every state. This is just one picture. That's Gardner at the top, Frances Willard underneath her, I think, or to the left of her, the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she used this magazine to raise awareness and also to lobby legislators. This is where Gardner learns the skills she later uses to get the 19th Amendment through Congress. She compiles vote tallies. She figures out who's who in every state. She figures out who's friends with recalcitrant legislators. She gets those women to contact men in every state. She sends her novels to legislators in states where age of consent bills are pending. And ultimately, Gardner and her allies succeed in raising the age of sexual consent to at least 14 or 16 in dozens of states, and in a few states, as we'll learn in a second, all the way to 18, which was their goal. Gardner is joined in this effort by Frances Willard, the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who really spearheaded this campaign beginning in the 1880s. And the temperance women were so invested in raising the age of consent because, as Frances Willard said, the Siamese twins of vice are strong drink and the degradation of woman. So they thought that curbing one would go a long way to curbing the other. I also argue in my book and in some other writings that the age of consent activism is what converted these 200,000 lukewarm, in some cases reluctant suffragists into active suffragists. And when these 200,000 Women's Christian Temperance Union ladies joined on with the suffrage movement, That is what begins to make the suffrage movement mainstream. That is what begins to make suffrage seem like it might actually be a reality. So that is why I think it's so important that we remember these age of consent campaigns. And I'm going to give you one example here that I think really crystallizes this. In 1894, Colorado enfranchised women. That same year, 3 women were elected to the Colorado state legislature, including Carrie Holley, who has the distinction of introducing the first bill ever proposed by a woman in a state legislature. Can you guess what it is? Of course you can, right? It was a bill to raise the age of sexual consent. Carrie Holley wanted to raise it all the way to 21, and she wanted it to pertain to both boys and girls. Through various compromise measures, she ends up succeeding in getting the age of consent raised all the way to 18. Women immediately noted that the states that raised the age of consent to 18 for girls were the very same states in which women had at least partial suffrage: Kansas, Wyoming, Colorado. This exemplifies to women that if you want control over what happens to your body, you also need the vote, and better yet, a voice in politics. So that is the sex portion of tonight. I want to pause here for a second, check in with Andy in the chat, and see what questions or we have so far.
Yeah, thank you so much for walking us through that narrative, that vignette. And from what I could tell from the audience chat, there were certainly many of our participants tonight who either hadn't heard of her or maybe didn't quite understand the early role that she played. One question that's come up, and I'm wondering if you can answer this from maybe both your scholar and your teacher hat, and that is, do you ever consider or do you teach temperance and suffrage together as social movements?
Yes and yes. So yes, as a teacher I do, and also as a scholar, I guess I'm sort of, this is often a question that comes up at the end of my talks, but I'll go ahead and answer it now, which is I'm planning for my next book to be a new history of the temperance movement. I really think that suffragists, the temperance activists, get a bad rap, right? They're, cranky, boring ladies who want to close down the party, which I think is totally wrong, could not be farther from the truth. And I think really we need to center sex and also sexually transmitted infections, which is something I also think and write a lot about in the context of the 19th century. We need to center that in the story of temperance, which I think reveals the temperance movement to be the Me Too movement of the 19th century. So my next project is going to be a new history of temperance, centering sex and sexual assault.
That's fascinating, and many of the folks in our audience are responding to the ways that you're tying that together. If we go back in time and back into your talk, given what you just said, this notion that could be considered the Me Too movement of the time, how easily transmitted were the ideas? How did these ideas get out in a viral way? How did this movement sort of gain the momentum that we can now use to call it a movement?
So the temperance activists were geniuses, right? And so they were, especially, their leader, Francis Willard. So they were so smart in reaching out to women, at first securing networks of women, making it comfortable for women to come together to talk about the issues that face them, and then to move into the public arena, and especially by organizing, right? They were so smart in the way that they had their federated structure of local chapters, state chapters reporting to the national. So the temperance movement was able to disseminate information, quickly, rapidly throughout the country because they had been so organized in every state. And I think that's a real victory of the movement, a real thing to pay attention to when we study them. And then the thing that I wanted to also highlight about how and why I became interested in this is I think Gardner's lover, Charles Smart, had syphilis. It's impossible to know for sure, so I don't really state that directly in my book, but that's what I think because of how Gardner thinks and writes and talks about syphilis, sometimes in open ways and sometimes in coded ways. So once I saw it in her writing, I began to see how much all the other women were also talking about syphilis. So then I began to wonder, like, what did this mean for women? You know, we often talk about syphilis in terms of prostitutes in the 19th century and efforts to regulate or inspect prostitutes, but what about all the wives? What about all the women who contracted it from their husbands, right? So syphilis and gonorrhea were more prevalent than all other infectious diseases combined, right? And women had no right to say no to their husbands at the time. They had no real right to divorce. So, you know, that would get me to a meeting. I don't know about you, but that would get me to go to a meeting. And I think that when we think in those terms, it really helps us understand temperance, right? Women may not have been as comfortable saying sex, but I think they were saying, we don't want our drunk husbands to come home and give us syphilis.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Any other questions, or shall we move on to theme two?
I think we'll move on. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I'm going to jump over many fascinating trials and tribulations and victories that Helen Hamilton Gardner experienced throughout the 1890s, and just jump ahead to the part where her lover, Charles Smart, dies. She had been living with him as if he were her husband this entire time since their affair began back in Sandusky. But as I mentioned at the outset, they were not, in fact, ever married. So when he dies in 1891, again, I think of syphilis in a sanitarium in Connecticut that Gardner had to go into debt to pay for. This creates a crisis for Gardner. His actual wife threatens to come to New York to challenge the probate, to go public. So Gardner suffers a breakdown. She pulls herself together by moving to Puerto Rico to visit this guy, Colonel Selden Allen Day, whom she had met back in the 1890s on her lecture tours. We can talk more about that later. So she moves to Puerto Rico, where Selden Allen Day was stationed. He was a lifelong Army officer, a Civil War hero, and shortly thereafter, they married. They then traveled the world for 5 years and had all sorts of adventures, including Gardner riding a camel across the deserts of Egypt to check out the pyramids. She took thousands of pictures, which are now at the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian, many of which are digitized, and I encourage you to check them out. And then in 1910, HHG and her husband, Colonel Day, moved to Washington, D.C., and they settle in this lovely house at 1838 Lamont Street Northwest. Now, Gardner had not previously been involved really in the suffrage movement. She had been best friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton before Stanton died in 1902, but they met on the Free Thought lecture circuit, and Gardner never joined a suffrage group. She sometimes spoke at Nassau meetings because Stanton invited her to, but she never considered herself really a suffragist, and she was never a card-carrying member until she moves to Washington in 1910. Now, her husband plays a big role. Colonel Day, as I mentioned, was a Civil War hero. He fought for the Union, but he had the distinction of guarding the cell of President Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, who was imprisoned at Fort Monroe after the Civil War. And Jefferson Davis's widow wrote in her memoir that Colonel Day had been so nice to Jefferson Davis that he brought him a rocking chair, that he gave him books. So all the Confederate veterans also really liked Colonel Day. So when Gardner and Day settle in Washington, Day's address book is chock full of all these Civil War heroes, Union and Confederate, and their sons and nephews. Well, who's in charge in Washington, D.C. in the 1910s? All the Civil War heroes, their sons and nephews. So this provides the insider entree that the suffragists had long sought. Gardner delivers it to them, together with, of course, her legendary personal charms, which we'll talk more about. So by 1912, Gardner has established herself as the suffragists' most efficient volunteer in Washington. She also secures this status because her lovely house on Lamont Street is right next door to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, James Beauchamp Champ Clark. Gardner brilliantly uses this proximity to the suffragist advantage. She befriends Clark. She does things like, you can see here, their porches adjoin. So she would wait inside of her door with her hat and coat on until she heard the sound of Representative Clark leaving his house, and then she'd appear as if by happenstance on her front porch and say, oh, hey, Champ Clark, how's it going? How's our bill coming along? Hey, did you establish our committee yet? And she would use those moments of intimate, friendly conversation to press her points. And this proves a huge advantage to the suffragists. But her first big public coup was helping Alice Paul. This is HHG and Alice Paul together at the makeshift Nassau office. Her first big coup is helping Alice Paul plan the landmark 1913 suffrage parade that the National American Women's Suffrage Association put together to coincide with the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. Until 2017, this was the biggest women's march in U.S. history, and Gardner was Alice Paul's right-hand woman. Alice Paul wrote that Gardner was the only other person with her there, sun up to sundown every day in the small basement office, and Gardner had two really important roles during the parade. One, she was press committee chair, so she sent out press releases, she called reporters and editors day in and day out across the country, and for the rest of her life, Alice Paul marveled at the amazing job HHG did as press committee chair, because this was the first time that suffragists secured positive national media attention, and that was all thanks to the efforts of Gardner, who drew on her decades of contacts as a writer and editor from the 1880s, 1890s. So she secures this wonderful press coverage for the event. And her second job was less public, and that was to secure all of the permits that the suffragists needed to march along Pennsylvania Avenue all the way to the White House. And this was not at all likely to happen. She encountered so many obstacles along the way. For example, at first, the chief of police said, oh, why don't you ladies march along 16th Street? It's a lovely shopping street, much more suitable for women. But Gardner and Alice Paul stood firm and said, no, we want to march from the Capitol to the White House because we are citizens. So Gardner secures all of the permits that enable this parade to happen. And I also want to point out here that this is where we really see the theme of race, and more to the point, racism enter our story for tonight. So Gardner and Alice Paul decide that they don't want to encourage African-American women to march in this parade. African-American women had marched in integrated parades, in smaller parades in the north, and Nassau headquarters in New York City encouraged them to also allow African-American women to march alongside white women in this Washington, D.C. parade. But Gardner says, no, you don't understand what Washington is like. She said, Washington, D.C. is a southern city. It's not Boston nor even New York, she writes. And she says, we have to remember that in 1912, not only did Woodrow Wilson win the White House, becoming the first Southerner to win since the Civil War, but also Southern Democrats took control of both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House, right? So she says, better not to highlight this issue. And this is the beginnings of this public racism that shape the rest of the suffrage movement, that shape its trajectory and indeed its legacy. Of course, dozens of African-American women do march in the parade, Ida B. Wells most famously, but many others. But Alice Paul did not encourage this. To the contrary, she cold-shouldered or ignored all of the African-American women who contacted the office in the hopes of marching in the parade. So this begins the race and racism part of our discussion. So the other element that emerges from the parade is that Gardner and Alice Paul, who start off as warm friends, who share a lot in common as lifelong firebrands, but they become enemies. They become lifelong rivals after spending so many hours together in that cramped basement office. And what they are fighting over and rivaling over is who is going to be the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington, D.C., who is going to be the voice of the suffrage movement to Congress and the White House. Alice Paul claims that role. Helen Hamilton Gardner thinks it should be her. So this is what prompts, in large part, Alice Paul's rift with Nassau. As you may know, Alice Paul then goes to start her own group, which becomes known as the National Woman's Party. And this rivalry also shapes the trajectory of the 19th Amendment and the history of it, how we remember it even today. Gardner uses her antipathy towards Alice Paul and Alice Paul's increasingly public protest tactics to gain entry into the White House and then Congress. For these efforts, Nassau begins calling her their diplomatic corps. And I'm going to give you just one example, and it's the very first example of HHG's diplomacy for Nassau vis-a-vis Alice Paul. So Helen Hamilton Gardner spent the winter of 1915 in California, where her husband, Colonel Day, owned property. She returns to Washington, and she's aghast that her rival, Alice Paul, has started heckling the president at his public appearances. She's not yet protesting at the White House, but she and her followers in the NWP are interrupting the president's speeches. They're chanting, they're being obnoxious. Gardner cannot believe it. So even though Gardner is a radical and a firebrand, she's always done so through her personal charms and polite letters. So she believes that Alice Paul is hurting the cause. So she picks up her pen and she sits down at her typewriter and she writes this letter to Wilson's chief of staff, a guy named Joseph Tumulty. And she says, "Hey, Tumulty, I realize you've never heard of me. Here's my calling card. Here's a list of references, all my friends in the Senate, in the House, my next door neighbor, Champ Clark. Here's a piece of Nassau letterhead with my name on it. This is who I am." And she says, "I write you today because I want you to know that Alice Paul does not speak for the real suffragists of America." She says, "The real suffragists of America are me and my colleagues in the National American Woman Suffrage Association, also known as Nassau, and we've been pursuing and fighting for the vote for decades." And she says, "We're nonpartisan, we're polite, you want to work with us." And then she encloses a memo, a typewritten memo that delineates for Tumulty the differences between Nassau and Alice Paul's National Women's Party. And then she does something even more clever. She attaches this handwritten postscript to the end of her letter. And she says, "Is there a day when Mrs. Wilson accepts callers? As the wife of an Army captain, it would give me great pleasure to call." So guess what happens next? The very next day, Mrs. Wilson invites HHG to the White House. From there, she's off and running. From the summer of 1916 through the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Gardner becomes a welcome daily presence at the White House. We can see this again that summer. A few weeks after Gardner sends this letter, the Nassau officers request a meeting with President Wilson. And this document here, which is from the Woodrow Wilson papers at the Library of Congress, really shocked me, because you can see here Wilson has no idea who these women are or that Nassau is different from the Congressional Union. So Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of Nassau, is writing him this letter, and Wilson writes, that's his own handwriting. You can see there, WW. Are these ladies of the Congressional Union variety? Those are the hecklers like Alice Paul. So now Wilson's been president for more than 3 years, and he still has no idea who is who, right? So what does Tumulty do? Tumulty shows him Gardner's typed-written memo to explain the differences and the who's who of it all. And then you can see Wilson says, okay, Tuesday, 10 p.m. 2 p.m. So not only does Gardner get herself in the White House, she gets Nassau in the White House. This is a picture of Gardner and Nassau President Carrie Chapman Catt on just one of their many, many visits to the Wilson White House. Gardner also telephoned every day. Tumulty and her write back and forth, telegrams, phone calls almost every day. Gardner cultivated such a close relationship with Wilson, his wife, and his top staff that she later boasted that she had asked for 22 favors on behalf of the suffragists and that he immediately granted 21 without question. Perhaps the most impactful favor that she asked and he granted was his help in securing the creation of the House Committee on Women's Suffrage. So now bear with me for a second. I know this probably sounds super boring, and it's nowhere near as sexy or as exciting as protesting at the White House and getting arrested for it. But this is the vital procedural measure that allowed the 19th Amendment to come to the floor for a vote. So there had been a Senate Committee on Women's Suffrage since the 1880s. And every year, the Nassau Congressional Committee got the Senate Committee to host hearings on the amendment, right? But there was no corollary committee in the House. So women tried to testify before the Rules Committee. They tried to testify before the Judiciary Committee, but they were constantly rebuffed. Furthermore, they needed a committee that would recommend a vote, right? You have to get your bill out of committee before it goes to the floor. So Gardner, for years and years, this is actually what prompts this rivalry with Alice Paul, is that Gardner has been trying ever since the parade to get this committee established. So she finally persuades Woodrow Wilson to help her in the summer of 1917. So here, again, she's very savvy. She says, oh, we're not going to do anything publicly to advocate for the vote when the U.S. has just entered World War I. No, we'll throw ourselves into war work, but behind the scenes, we'll work for this committee. And that's just what she did. So she gets Wilson to agree to write this Representative Pugh of North Carolina, actually. He's the chair of the Rules Committee. She gets Wilson to write Pugh and say, hey, I really think you need to create this committee on women's suffrage. So by the end of the year, the committee is created. And then at the very beginning of 1918, when the House convenes right after the creation of this committee, immediately the House votes on the 19th Amendment for the very first time in January 1918, and it passes. This is in large part due to Gardner's clever negotiating and diplomacy. And she does this all the while by kind of framing herself as the antidote to Alice Paul. So Alice Paul convinces Wilson that he needs to deal with the suffragists, but he most certainly does not want to deal with Alice Paul, so he deals with Helen Hamilton Gardner. Alice Paul had no idea that while she's protesting outside the White House, Helen Hamilton Gardner has charmed her way inside.
And Kimberly?
Do we have any questions on this Alice Paul business?
Yeah, we do. And I want to clarify this because it's such a fascinating overlay. And the clarification is that these two women, this was not a coordinated cop, bad cop, right? This was, they legitimately were rivals, and this played out the way it did, but they were not in any way kind of manipulating the scenario that you just outlined.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And so, sorry if I made it seem like that, but no, they have no idea. I mean, well, Gardner is manipulating it because Gardner uses, Woodrow Wilson's antipathy towards Alice Paul as her wedge, right? She says, obviously you have to talk to a suffragist, but you should talk to me. So Gardner does it kind of on purpose, but Alice Paul has no idea. And Alice Paul is so mad her whole life. So I say her whole life because this is based on the oral history that you can access. I think it's online through Berkeley Library, but Alice Paul records this oral history with Amelia Fry in the 1970s. So, 50 plus years later. And even then she's like, I can't believe, and I'm not going to say exactly what she says, but there's a couple really pivotal things that HHG gets that Alice Paul doesn't. And so 50 plus years later, Alice Paul is saying, and I can't believe that Helen Gardner got blah, 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 right? And I'll tell you what blah, blah, blah is at the end, but she's so mad. She has no idea that Gardner was such a successful diplomat.
Yeah, and you did not imply that at all, but I thought it was an important point to really underscore for our audience that these were not in any way coordinated efforts. Another quick question for you before we move on. I wonder if you can speak some to some of the resources you're sharing. There's such lovely and wonderful images. Savannah Murray, who was a grad student who worked with us this past summer and is now out in the western part of North Carolina, noted early on the power of archival work. And more recently, Christopher in Los Angeles noted that one of these images was just absolutely beautiful. Tell us where you got them and how you found them. And, while the PowerPoint will be available, is there a place that our participants can also find these kinds of images?
Yes, so most of my images come from Library of Congress prints and photographs. And if there's a particular image that you want to know about, I could tell you more details, but most of these images are from Library of Congress prints and photographs. The one of Gardner as a young girl is in the Nassau collection at Library of Congress, not prints and photographs. Same with the one of her as a teacher, and then the one of her brain I took myself. Same with the one of her house in Sandusky I took myself. But I do want to say a word about the archival work of this. And thank from the bottom of my heart all the archivists that are and librarians who are with us tonight. I gave a talk for the Society of Ohio Archivists that's on their YouTube channel, where I talked much more specifically about finding race, sex, and gender in the archives, because it is generally so obscured. So one thing, for example, that really floored me, and another reason why I knew I had to write this book, is guess who appears in Woodrow Wilson's papers more than any other woman except for his wives? Helen Hamilton Gardner. She's all over the Woodrow Wilson archives. But in the indexes, in the early kind of, finding aids to the Woodrow Wilson papers, suffrage does not really emerge as a key theme, right? Because when his papers are being described and indexed so many years ago, that's not something that people are thinking is important, right? So Gardner, you have to look for her, but once you do, she's everywhere in the Woodrow Wilson papers. So that was a big source for me. And that's where, for example, like this comes from, this memo, and then also this Tumulty letter from the Woodrow Wilson archives at Library of Congress. Same, there's also a lot of Gardner stuff in the Tumulty collection there. So I also looked at the papers of Edith Wilson, Wilson's top staff. His other chief of staff was named Rudolph Forster, and then Wilson's biographer, Ray Stannard Baker. So there's a lot of stuff there. I also want to say go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I stepped on you. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say one other thing about sources, and that's the importance of the digitization of small and local newspapers and periodicals. It would have been impossible to tell this story, and I also would have told a completely different story were it not for the digitization of small and local newspapers and periodicals. So big thanks to the National Humanities Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and all of the humanities and library organizations that work so assiduously to digitize these documents. So, for example, Gardner's whole life, she keeps the secret about her affair, right? So, like the Wikipedia may have been changed now that my book is out, but until then, every encyclopedia entry of Gardner, every who's who in America about Gardner writes as if Charles Smart was really her husband. But with the help of local history experts and librarians here at the Cincinnati Public Library, we delved deep into these digitized collections of Ohio newspapers and found, oh, they totally were not married, and they had this affair, right? That had never been something Gardner ever talked about, had never been revealed before, and the only way we found it out was by searching these collections of digitized local newspapers. Another source that revealed a ton about Gardner's life and her comings and goings was this free thought periodical called Truth Seeker, which is still running. It's the nation's longest running free thought periodical, but it too has been digitized and searchable. And because HHG was like such a star in the movement, even if she didn't write anything for each particular issue, they would say like where she was or who saw her where, what she was doing. So I found out a lot about her from that periodical as well.
Great. One last question about one of these resources before we move on, and that's on slide 55. I'm going to bring it up for our audience. We did have a question from the group. Why do you think if this was about sort of business, why did she write personal at the top?
Oh, that's a good question. I think because she wanted to make sure he read it, and because she was writing in person, she included her picture, she introduced herself, and I think she trash talked Alice Paul, so it was not a formal letter. And I also asked myself, like, going through the Woodrow Wilson collection, all the suffrage stuff, I also asked myself, like, why this letter? Like, why HHG, right? I mean, there's hundreds of the letter. I mean, Wilson was bombarded, right? And like, he didn't even know by the summer of 1916 who Carrie Chapman Catt was. So what about this letter stood out? Why did Gardner get the meeting? And I think because it was kind of personal, she included her calling card. She wrote, a friend kind of, and she wrote that handwritten PS to Mrs. Wilson. And also, this is going to sound sort of obvious maybe, but it's typewritten. So a lot of these letters that Wilson got were really hard to read. I mean, and maybe Tumulty didn't have time, to get out his magnifying glass and parse these, hard to read handwritten letters. But here's a useful letter. It's typewritten, a memo attached, which provides Tumulty information he could actually use. And interestingly, that memo that Gardner included about the differences between NAWSA and NWP later gets inserted in the congressional record to help congressmen figure out who's who, because congressmen also couldn't keep track of, which uppity women were which.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Professor, we have about 20 minutes or so left, so I'm going to bring us back to where we left off on slide 61 and invite you to draw your conclusions.
Great. Okay, so you remember where we left off in our chronology. We are in January of 1918, where the House Committee on Women's Suffrage gets created, and then the House reconvenes in January and immediately votes on the 19th Amendment. This is the first time that Woodrow Wilson comes out publicly in support of the Federal Amendment, again, in large part thanks to HHG, and the House narrowly passes the 19th Amendment. It immediately then goes to the Senate, where Carrie Chapman Catt and others are super hopeful. They think they're going to get the 19th Amendment through Congress in 1918 during the 65th Congress, which will give them plenty of time, they think, to vote in 1920, because to get it ratified, not all state legislatures meet every year. So they want the maximum time to be ratified for 1920, and they think 1918 is going to be the year. But obviously, they are totally wrong. They run into what Carrie Chapman Catt calls the Southern Wall of Opposition in the Senate. This is epitomized by Senator John Sharp Williams of Mississippi, who was a good friend of HHG for reasons that I will skip over now, but they're good friends. And so Gardner starts her diplomacy with him. Immediately after the House passes, she knows she needs a couple more votes in the Senate, and she knows that they need some Southern support, right? Because a congressional amendment needs to pass with 2/3 majority and then be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So you need at least a little bit of Southern support. John Sharp Williams is her close friend. John Sharp Williams is known as the most erudite man in the Senate. They trade books back and forth. He's highly educated. He has daughters. He educates his daughters at the best schools. Surely she can get John Sharp Williams on board. So immediately she writes him this letter, this 3-page letter. And this is in the John Sharp Williams collection at Library of Congress, Chronological Files. She writes him this letter, and she first says, "Oh, gosh, it was so great how we celebrated my birthday together last year. And, I've been thinking about you and your wife. And did you study the House vote on the 19th Amendment? And did you notice that your state," excuse me, let me take a sip of water. And she says, "Did you notice that your state of Mississippi was solidly united against passage?" She says, "I want you to redeem your state, John Sharp Williams. You are by far Mississippi's greatest citizen. I know you know that the vote for women is coming. Why not get on the right side of history? Why not give your children and grandchildren something to be proud of? Why not do the right thing?" He immediately writes her back the very next day, and he says, "Helen, my dear friend, if anything in the world could get me to do the thing you want, it would be your letter." But he writes, "I will never vote for the 19th Amendment, even though it means denying you, my wife, my daughters, the vote." Why? Because he writes, "I will never vote to enfranchise the Black women in Mississippi." He says, "If I lived in any white state, I would surely vote yes, but not in Mississippi." Why? He says, because everyone knows Black women will go to the polls while white women will sit home. Furthermore, he goes on, and this is the really shocking part, and this is the second excerpt that I pasted at the end. He says, "Furthermore, the real reason that Black men in Mississippi don't vote is not because all of the legal barriers we have passed to bar them from the polls, like literacy tests and poll tax. No, he says, the real reason Black men in Mississippi don't vote is because they know if some of them do, they will get hurt." And he says, "But we can't employ violence against Black women because after all, they are women." So this letter really shocked me because it was so explicit about why no, right? And this was something I've begun seeing repeated again and again and again as I studied HHG's correspondence with members of Congress, particularly in the Senate, and as I studied Senate debates about the 19th Amendment. Again, why the Senate? Because the House passed it and that was not a problem. So the real debates about the 19th Amendment happen in the Senate. And there, the key objection is has nothing to do with, women voting, destroying the family, has nothing to do with old arguments like women lack the rational capacity to vote. No one is saying anything like that by 1918. The only objection still on the table is Black women voting in the South. So this, to me, stood out as a really big aha moment. And what also struck me is that it wasn't just senators from the South. It wasn't just Southern Democrats. It was men from all regions and both parties. Another big example of this is Senator William Borah, the Lion of Idaho. He had been on record as a supporter of suffrage. Women had voted in Idaho since the 1890s. Nassau trotted him out to events all the time to get him to speak about how awesome it was that women voted in his state. And he did so gladly. So they were shocked when William Borah refused to support the federal amendment. Why? He said because he only supported women voting on a state-by-state basis, because he too did not want to enfranchise millions of Black women in the South. He went on to say, and this is one of the primary sources I contributed to the library, so you can check out the whole thing there, but he goes on to say, we in Congress are being asked to write into the Constitution a fundamental lie. And he says, the 15th Amendment, which on paper extended the vote to Black men, has never been enforced. Congress has done nothing to enforce it since 1877. And he says, now we're being asked to write into the Constitution another fundamental lie. No one thinks that we're going to enforce or uphold the rights of Black women in the South to vote. And he says, so I'm not going to write into the Constitution another lie. So he too votes no on the 19th Amendment. And that was really surprising to me. And it showed to me the breadth and depth of this race-based opposition to women voting. Senators, again, to repeat, from both parties, all regions of the country objected to the 19th Amendment because they didn't want to enfranchise Black women in southern states where the Black population outnumbered the white, and because they feared that the 19th Amendment would somehow compel the federal government to uphold the 15th Amendment, which it had not done since 1877. So there was this sense that the 19th Amendment was like a doubling down of the 15th, that it was another federal incursion into states' rights to regulate the vote. And that really fueled the opposition. And I'm going to give you a couple other quotes in a second to show this and more clearly. But the main thing I want you to remember is that ultimately the 19th Amendment does pass both houses of Congress in June of 1919, but not because anyone thinks it will enfranchise Black women in the South. It passes Congress because everyone knows it won't. So white suffragists like Gardner, like Carrie Chapman Catt, like Alice Paul, make clear to Southern leaders and to white leaders from the North and West as well that they have no intention of asking for the 19th Amendment to be upheld in the South. To the contrary, Carrie Chapman Catt says, you know what, we support state-based restrictions, signaling to the South, go ahead and continue to discriminate against Black women voters in just the exact same way you've been disfranchising Black men through poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. And that is how the 19th Amendment gets through Congress. When it finally did pass, these are two examples of what senators said. So Cotton Ed Smith, again, reiterates these connections between the 19th and the 15th, which he describes as the crime of the century. And then Senator Marcus Aurelius Jones, who had been the chair of the Senate Committee on Women's Suffrage, so he's a pro-19th Amendment guy, he says, don't worry, the 19th Amendment is not going to be a reaffirmation or readoption of the 15th. So again, they're signaling, just keep barring Black women from the polls, just like you have been doing for Black men. And that's really the story of how the 19th Amendment gets through Congress. Now, in the few minutes we have left, I want to talk a little bit more about memory. This is a picture of Gardner at the congressional signing ceremony of the joint congressional resolution of the 19th Amendment before the 19th Amendment is sent out to the states for ratification. This is Gardner seated behind the Speaker of the House. It's no longer Champ Clark because Republicans took control of the House in 1918. But there she is. Why is she in this picture? Because she planned the signing ceremony. It's the very first signing ceremony of its kind. Previously, there had only been public signing ceremonies for treaties, but Gardner plans this signing ceremony because she wants the historical record to reflect this huge accomplishment of women. She makes sure that she is there, that her colleagues in Nassau are there, which also super enrages Alice Paul, who you will note is not there. This is one of the things that Alice Paul is mad about 50 years later. Gardner even buys the fancy gold pen that the Speaker of the House and the next day the Vice President used to sign the 19th Amendment before sending it off to the states for ratification. And there's HHG there on the right next to the Vice President. Gardner is so well-connected, so influential, so impactful that President Woodrow Wilson appoints her to the U.S. Civil Service Commission in March of 1920, even before the 19th Amendment is ratified. This makes her the highest-ranking woman in federal government. These were the happiest years of her life. She began to put into practice some of the ideals for which she had long fought, such as the right of married women to keep working. And she becomes a national symbol on front pages of newspapers from coast to coast, a national symbol of what it finally means for women to be full citizens, or in this case, white women to be full citizens. But she's not done. She's really concerned about memory and legacy. The reason she bought this gold pen is because she wants to send it to the Smithsonian. So days after the signing ceremonies, she contacts the leaders of the Smithsonian after securing an introduction from the White House. And she says, hey, I have all of these suffrage relics from Nassau's DC headquarters, from this gold pen. You need to put together a big exhibit on women's suffrage at the Smithsonian, America's museum, she said, so that future generations can learn about these women. Much to her dismay, the exhibit does happen, but it's very small and it's in a corner, and it's benignly titled An Important Epic in History. Not at all what Gardner had in mind. Gardner wanted to change the way we tell the story of America. She wanted to center women. She wanted women's contributions to be moved from the sidebar to the main story of American life. This also was a goal of the suffrage movement more broadly. In 1909, the Nassau Education Committee commissioned a study to see how women were depicted in civics and history textbooks. At that year's annual convention, the committee chair reported that history and civics textbooks treat history as if it had been made by and for men. Sadly, I think this is by and large still the case even in 2020, as that 2017 report compiled by the National Women's History Museum Foundation shows. And here I want to end with this picture. This is Gardner on her beloved Andalusian horse named Caillou, and she's in front of the General Logan statue in Washington, D.C. in 1902. Gardner lived to see the commemoration of the Civil War, the construction of the Lincoln Monument, and dozens of bronze statues to Civil War heroes across Washington, D.C. And here I think she's saying, where's my statue? When will women be commemorated in public life? She's posing just like the statue behind her, asking us, what would America look like if we centered women? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for sharing your thoughts tonight. And we've got just a few minutes left. I'm going to encourage our audience to add any questions or any final comments or clarifications that you have in mind in the Q&A section in the lower left-hand corner. And as we're waiting for this, and I'm going to give folks just a moment or two to put together their thoughts, but I wonder if you can extend the storyline you told just briefly enough to the mid and later part of the 20th century. Did the story that you told and the momentum that you described, when did it wane, or did it? What were the obstacles throughout the 20th century that maybe caused that momentum to slow?
Oh my gosh. In 5 minutes or less? Okay. Let me Okay. Let me say real quickly that in one thing, and this is described in great detail by a scholar named Paula Monopoly in her new book, Constitutional Orphan. One thing that happens is this wonderful interracial cross-class coalition that comes together for the vote splinters and disbands after ratification. So Alice Paul's Women's Party goes for the Equal Rights Amendment immediately. Nassau becomes the League of Women Voters, focused on, civics and voter education. Neither agrees to work with African American women. So African American women leaders like Mary Church Terrell, they go to the League. She goes to League of Women Voters. She goes to Alice Paul at NWP and says, "Hey, it's great that we got the 19th Amendment ratified, but Black women in the South still can't vote. Can we work together to make sure the 19th Amendment is enforced, is upheld?" And the white leaders say, "Nope, that is not our issue. That's a quote unquote race issue." So in this new book, Paula Monopoly is studying why the 19th Amendment is what she describes as thinly interpreted as opposed to thickly interpreted, like the 14th Amendment, for example. So why wasn't the 19th Amendment more broadly applied to equality, such as, women running for office, serving on juries? Why wasn't it used to enfranchise more women of color? Well, that's because the women who had fought for it didn't really stick around to make sure that it was enforced. So that's one answer to your question. And the other is the Equal Rights Amendment does splinter in different ways this coalition, at least at first, right, as it tends to pit working women and women involved in the labor union against more upper class women like Alice Paul, who are concerned with equality measures, whereas the other coalition wants protective labor laws in place to secure workplace safety for women laborers and wage earners. So that's a quick answer that takes.
Yeah, it is. It's a great answer. Thank you. I'm going to give the last question to Meryl Draft, who's a grad student at NC State, just on the road in Raleigh. She asks, how do you see your work fitting into current issues about saving American history talks?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the more stories we tell of women, the more stories we tell of people of color, the more we move away from these kind of myths of American history to the truth. I think the more interesting and engaging history becomes, right? To me, that's patriotic history. To me, telling these stories of people who spent their lives working for equality, working for the vote, working for civil rights, that's patriotic history. That's inspiring. That gives us reasons to latch on. That gives us more names to know, more faces to recognize, more ways to see ourselves in America, and more future possibilities for what America might be like and the kind of America that we might want to live in.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to settle on your last slide. Would you like to provide any context for this before we say goodnight?
Oh, sure. I just think sometimes people ask about the book cover, so I just included this in case that was a question. Some people say, is that HHG on the cover? And the answer is not really. The cover is inspired by this beautiful art that was created by suffragists themselves, and it was the logo for the Ohio woman suffragists. And then on the right is a picture of HHG from about 1913. So she kind of looks like that, but it's not based on her. That's what I want to know.
Great. Professor, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really do appreciate your thought. I want to remind our audience that the PowerPoint and a recording of tonight's session will be in the digital library, so you can go back and linger and pause and maybe construct some instruction that comes from this informative discussion. Thanks again.
Can we put in a last minute plug for the primary sources too?
Yes, please.
Okay, so also the primary sources, HHG's letter to Tumulty, HHG's letter to John Sharp Williams and his reply, and William Borah's letter to the chair of the Idaho Republican Party explaining why he's going to vote no, are also all in the National Humanities Center library.
Fantastic, thank you. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight at the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Please do follow us on our social media feeds. Our Facebook and our Twitter feeds are particularly active, and you'll receive notices and information about upcoming opportunities, both virtual and in person. Our next session is scheduled for September 29th. We'll be joined by Darren Linville, who's a professor of communications at Clemson University. His session is titled Social Media and Disinformation. Seems particularly timely now as we quickly move towards the next election. Kimberly, thanks again for joining us. I want to thank everybody tonight. Please have a great day at school tomorrow, whether you're at home or with your students in person. We'll see you next time on the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you so much.